Welcome to Ann Teaches Bible. Today we are beginning in Luke chapter 6 verse 1. We finally finished chapter 5, and the two stories I intend to talk about and teach on are about the Sabbath day. And it occurred to me that not everybody will know what the Sabbath day is about. And so I thought we better have a quick history lesson. The Sabbath day, Sabbath day is the day of rest, and it goes all the way back to Genesis, the very first book in the Bible. In fact, it's all the way back to the creation, so that would be Genesis 1:1 is where it begins. But I won't read that whole thing, although it says, I will read Genesis 1:1, and it's, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. And so the whole first chapter tells about how God created the heavens and earth, how he divided the waters and created the light, and caused plants to grow on the land, and he made the creatures of the earth, of the land, and the creatures of the ocean. And then on the sixth day he made man, and he looked at Adam and he said it's not good that Adam should be all by himself, and so he created woman. He created Adam's mate, his wife, Eve. But then in chapter 2, we'll begin with chapter 2 verses 1 through 3. So the creation of the heavens and the earth and everything in them was completed. Verse 2. On the seventh day God had finished his work of creation, so he rested from all his work. 3. And God blessed the seventh day and declared it holy, because it was the day when he rested from all his work of creation. And now I want to point out, this resting isn't a rest of, oh, I'm so tired. It's more of a rest of wanting just to relax from the creation that he has done, and relax and enjoy it. And that's the thing about the Sabbath day, is it's supposed to be a day of enjoyment, a day when we can spend time before the Lord and not be consumed with our regular work. In my culture, we have people who work all day, every day, day after day, and this is so wrong. We need to have that day when we take time just to relax and to spend a little time with the Lord and just come to a place of quietness. Now, generally in my culture, again, the Sabbath day is on a Saturday, the 7th. The Jewish people, that was their day of rest. That was the Sabbath day. Now, Christians have chosen to rest on Sunday, which is from the New Testament, when I didn't look it up in the Bible, but it says that the Christians went to the synagogue on the first day of the week, and so that's Sunday. But technically, it's not a rule that it has to be on Saturday for it to be Sabbath. It just needs to be a day of rest. Every 7 days, the Lord says, you've got to take a day off. You've got to stop running around. Now, when you look at God's creation, think about it. He's the creator, and anyone who makes something, like the people who made the cars, or the people who make a refrigerator, they give out a little book that says how to use it, and they tell what you should do and what you should not do. Well, if you think about it that way, God is our creator, and the Bible tells us how to use who we are and how we should treat the earth. And the creator, God, said, take a day off. You need a day of rest. And that's why he took a day of rest. And so it was the law. It was, the Lord said, make it a law, that you would take a day of rest. And so the Jewish people did. And there's the 10 Commandments. I've spoken about them before. Each of these, the Lord has reasons to tell us to do something or not to do something. And so the first one is to honor the Lord, and the second one is don't have any other gods in front of him. Some people, they worship, it's called pantheism. All gods. Everything's a god. No, that's not biblical. God alone is God, and he's the God of all gods. He's the Lord of lords. And then, so going back to the 10 commandments, we have 10 different commandments, and the fourth one is the Sabbath day. And here's what it says in the 10 commandments. That's in Exodus chapter 20, verses 8 through 11. And now this is just about the Sabbath day. I'm not reading the other commands. So verse 8, remember to observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. You have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath day of rest, dedicated to the Lord your God. On that day, no one in your household may do any work. This includes you, your sons and daughters, your male and female servants, your livestock, and any foreigners living among you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens, the earth, the sea, and everything in them. But on the seventh day he rested. That is why the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and set it apart as holy. And I think that some ways we've come so far that we kind of forget that the Sabbath day, it's holy and it's blessed. He blessed it to us. And so this is where we are in Luke chapter 6, is talking about the Sabbath. Now, another thing I need to talk about before we get there, and that is the Pharisees. They were the legal rulers of, the country of Israel. Not the legal, I said that wrong. They were the religious rulers of Israel. Now, Rome had taken over Israel, and the Rome was actually, I guess you'd say, the legal ruler of Israel, because Rome had their own laws, and the Jewish people were obligated both to follow the Jewish law and to follow the Roman law. And the Pharisees were the religious leaders, and they also were they were the ones basically who kept the Jewish law, because the Jewish law was religious law. But by this time, it's been 3,000 or 4,000 years since the Lord created the earth and since he instituted the 10 commandments. And the Pharisees had gotten very, very legalistic. They started out just defining what the law was. Well, let's go with Sabbath day. What is work? I can just hear some guy saying, well, I don't think it's work because, and so the Pharisees, they sat there and they defined what was work. And it sounds good until it sounds good until you get to where you're wondering if the how much work is work. Whether if a lady picks up a piece of clothing from the floor, has she worked? And so that's the thing. They had gone all the way into legalism. So let's start with Luke 6 now. One Sabbath day, as Jesus was walking through some grain fields, his disciples broke off heads of grain, rubbed off the husks in their hands, and ate the grain. But some Pharisees said, why are you breaking the law by harvesting grain on the Sabbath day? You see, this is where they had gotten all the way into legalism. They had recognized that harvesting is work. And they had gotten to the point where they felt like just plucking a little grain off of, a head of wheat and just, popping that in the mouth. Well, that was work, and they were breaking the law. And this was never the Lord's intention, that they, couldn't even do these little things. But that's where they were now. So verse 3, Jesus replied, haven't you read in the scriptures what David did when he and his companions were hungry? He went into the house of God and broke the law by eating the sacred loaves of bread that only the priests can eat. He also gave some to his companions. Now, that's a story. It's in, where do I have it? It's in 1 Samuel chapter 21, verses 3 through 6, and that's exactly what happened. David was he's running from King Saul. He saw, came to the temple where the priests were. He went up to the priest and said, I need some of the bread. My men are hungry. And the priest said, well, I, can't give that to you. That's holy bread. You know that. And David said, it's old. You're going to be putting new holy bread on it. And my people are hungry. And the priest said, go ahead, take it. So the priest himself recognized that the law was not to be like a cage to hold the people in. The law was to help people to be strong and healthy. And David needed that bread, and so the priest gave the bread to him. And if you want to go back and study 1 Samuel 21 and then again in chapter 22, you'll find out how this whole story ends. And it didn't end very good for the priest, but it wasn't from God. God did not, punish the priest for doing that. God was blessing David. So Jesus points that out in verses 3 and 4 about David. So let's go back to verse 5. This is Luke 6, verse 5. And Jesus added, the Son of Man is Lord, even over the Sabbath. Now Jesus called himself the Son of Man, and he said that he was Lord. He was the master of the Sabbath. That didn't set well with the Pharisees. They didn't like it. I did want to point out in Matthew chapter 2, verse 27. No, I'm sorry, that's Mark. Mark chapter 2, verse 27. It's the same story. But where are we now? To the wrong chapter. Mark chapter 2, verse 27. It's the very same story. But Jesus says here, the Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people, and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath. That was Mark 2, 27 and 28. And I thought that was interesting how Mark said it even more, that the Sabbath was made for people, not the people for the Sabbath. Back to the law was not meant to be a cage to hold people tightly in. It was supposed to teach people right and wrong and how to do what was best and healthy. So let's continue on. Now, it's Luke. This is the second story about the Sabbath. Luke chapter 6 again, verse 6. On another Sabbath day, a man with a deformed right hand was in the synagogue while Jesus was teaching. The teachers of religious law and the Pharisees watched Jesus closely. If he healed the man's hand, they planned to accuse him of working on the Sabbath. Again, they're just so legalistic. They were strangling the people with these laws. And these were not even exactly the laws the Lord had given. When he said, honor the Sabbath and don't work on the Sabbath, he didn't mean for people to break it down with so much that Jesus was that any man was going to be mistreated because he was to heal somebody on the Sabbath day. Oh yeah, and that's what Jesus is going to do. Of course, we know he's going to heal this man with the deformed hand. And verse 8 says, but Jesus knew their thoughts. He said to the man with the deformed hand, come, stand in front of everyone. So the man came forward. I love that. Jesus isn't going to try and sneak this by. Maybe nobody will notice. No, he did it right in front of everybody. And he did. He confronted the Pharisees with their legalism. Verse 9. Then Jesus said to his critics, I have a question for you. Does the law permit good deeds on the Sabbath, or is it a day for doing evil? Is this a day to save a life or to destroy it?" He looked around at them one by one and then said to the man, "Hold out your hand." So the man held out his hand, and it was restored. At this, the enemies of Jesus were wild with rage and began to discuss what to do with him. So here this man, a deformed hand, it doesn't tell us how or why, but this man it would be very difficult for him to work. And the Pharisees didn't care about this man. And Jesus took that opportunity not just to heal the man, but to teach the Pharisees that they needed to do good. They need to follow the heart of God. And this is the thing we find. The law of keeping the Sabbath, my culture doesn't do it well. We need to take that time to rest. But they didn't do it well either. They were going so far into the legalism that they were strangling the people. In Matthew chapter 3, verse 23, they took another part of the law about tithing. Now, tithing is giving 10% of whatever you make or whatever you earn, giving it back to the Lord. And yes, this is something that we need to do. And most people give that 10% to their church or wherever they're meeting, wherever they come together as Christians and learn about the Lord. And so in verse 23, Jesus is talking to them and says, "What sorrows await you, teachers of religious law?" Where am I? "Teachers of religious law, and you Pharisees, hypocrites, for you're careful to tithe even the tiniest income from your herb gardens, but you ignore the most important aspects of the law: justice, mercy, and faith. You should tithe, yes, but do not neglect the more important things." And that's the thing that the Lord, that Jesus said. He was Lord of the Sabbath. And here his people were just dying because of legalism. And this is why he came, and he just came not to destroy the law. The Bible is very careful that Jesus did not come to destroy the law, but to breathe life in the law into our hearts, so that we do the things of the law from our hearts. And having a day to rest, or giving our workers a day of rest, well, of course, this is the Lord's way of doing things. And yes, if we had any way to heal a man on the Sabbath day, of course we would. And we do, because we're following Jesus. Now, I have just a few more minutes to finish up my lesson today, and it's not about the Sabbath. It's about calling the apostles. As Jesus grew in his ministry, more and more people followed him. And they are called disciples. Literally, a disciple is one who follows a master or a teacher and wants to be like him. So if we have Jesus in our hearts, we are all disciples. But as more and more people came, Jesus chose 12 people that he could pour his life into. And so the word is appointed. He appointed 12 people, and we use that word apostles. And this is where we get the apostles. And remember, I talked about Matthew or Levi being an apostle, and Peter is an apostle. This is one of the, I think there's 4 lists of the apostles. And so this is Luke 6, verse 12. We're going to go all the way through verse 16. One day soon afterward, Jesus went up on a mountain to pray, and he prayed to God all night. At daybreak, he called together all of his disciples and chose 12 of them to be apostles. The Bible doesn't say outright, but I assume that's what part of what he was praying all night was God was his father. So he's praying and he's discussing with God what to do about so many disciples. And this is the outcome of that night's worth of prayer, is he chose 12 of them to be apostles. Here are their names. Simon, whom he named Peter, and you remember we talked about Simon Peter a lot. Andrew, Peter's brother. James, John, Philip, Bartholomew, Matthew, and that's Levi that we just talked about. And I told you last time in the study that the Bible doesn't say why he's called Levi sometimes and Matthew sometimes. So this time they call him Matthew. So that's verse 15. Matthew, Thomas, James, son of Alphaeus, Simon, who was called the Zealot. We had two Simons, Simon Peter and Simon the Zealot. And James, the son of Alphaeus, also was another James. James the Less is what some places call him. Judas, son of James, not son of the apostle James, but of a man named James. Judas Iscariot, who later betrayed him. And so that's the end of verse 16. I've got, next time I'll start with Luke chapter 6, verse 17. And it'll be more about Jesus' ministry. I hope this blessed you. Thank you for listening to Ann Teaches Bible.